Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this installment, Tom Holland and Mark Wahlberg team up in the video game adaptation Uncharted. Nathan Drake, played by Tom Holland, is working as a bartender and pickpocket when he is propositioned by fortune hunter Victor Sully Sullivan, played by Mark Wahlberg, who previously worked alongside Nathan's brother Sam, played by Rudy Pankow, who has gone missing. Determined to find Sam, Nathan teams up with Sully and fellow fortune hunter Chloe Fraser, played by Sophia to find a treasure linked to the Magellan expedition, but they soon find themselves racing to beat Santiago Mancada, played by Antonio Banderas, the last descendant of the family that financed the expedition, and his team, including Tati Gabrielle's Joe Braddock, who will stop at nothing to get what Santiago thinks is rightfully his. Uncharted is of course based on the popular video game franchise, which you would think would be a natural fit for the big screen given it's already inspired by the likes of Indiana Jones, if maybe somewhat derivative, but actually this film adaptation has endured a very rocky road to the screen, being stuck in development hell for the best part of a decade, with numerous cast members and directors falling through the cracks. For many years, fans wanted Nathan Fillion to play Nathan Drake, especially once he played the character in an online fan film, so certainly they were very surprised, if not outright disappointed, when Tom Holland of Spider-Man fame was cast in the role, who was certainly no one's top pick for it. But it certainly makes a lot of sense once you realise the film is produced by Avi Arad, who of course backs the Sony Spider-Man and Marvel films, and the film is eventually brought to the screen by director Ruben Fleisher of Venom and Zombieland fame. So Uncharted has a lot of the DNA of the Sony, Marvel and Spider-Man adjacent properties. And even after all those delays, Uncharted still had to go through one more because it only got through a single day of filming in March of 2020 before it got shut down by COVID, and then they had to wait 4 months to resume production for the rest of the movie. And it definitely seems like Uncharted is not just an attempt to launch a franchise, obviously, but also to set up a whole bunch of video game adaptations of Sony's PlayStation properties, because the film opens with a PlayStation Productions logo that shamelessly tries to copy Marvel's, almost as a statement of intent. So basically, Sony is eyeing Uncharted as the first in an attempt to replace Marvel with their own PlayStation adaptations. I have to make a small confession, I'm not really a video game person. I got out of that scene a long time ago for the most part, so I haven't played any of the Uncharted games, but even some of my very limited knowledge of the source material, and someone that is trying to review this as a movie by itself, even someone like me can see that Tom Holland is blatantly miscast. At least in some respects. When it comes to the action side of the role, Holland of course acquits himself very nicely, because he's Spider-Man, he's in that kind of shape, and this is a very physically demanding part that requires someone to be athletic in the way that Tom Holland can be. So there's lots of running and jumping and platforming and being suspended around in the air. It definitely feels like the film is tailored towards Holland's abilities in that respect, and sometimes that works quite well. There's a sequence where he's dangling off lights from the ceiling that almost has a debt to, say, Jackie Chan's famous leap in Police Story. However, when it comes to the actual portrayal of Nathan Drake outside of the action sequences, that's where Tom Holland starts to struggle, because the problem is that it requires someone that has a little bit of grit about them, and clearly the thought behind the casting of Tom Holland here is that he'll grow into the role. The idea is that this sort of functions as an origin story for the character because we're gonna make sequels. So Tom Holland, he's gonna get more confident playing the character, and he's sort of finding himself as he goes along in the role. That's clearly the idea here. The problem is that I just don't think that's going to really happen for him. Now, I may not be overly familiar with the games, but I know what kind of character traditionally leads a film like this, and I know what gamers think of in their mind's eye when they think of Nathan Drake, and Tom Holland just simply doesn't have those qualities. He's too squeaky clean and wet behind the ears. This was a guy that up until recently was playing high schoolers in his mid-20s, and I just don't think he has the roguish charm that you would expect with someone leading this kind of fare. And I think that the problem is that while the character can be naive and inexperienced, he can still have those qualities that we expect from the video game that audiences would want to see out of a character being depicted on screen that they've played as in several games. But Holland isn't giving that character. Instead, he's basically playing Spider-Man if he wasn't bitten by a radioactive spider, but still had an uncanny propensity for getting somehow strung up in midair. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, it's just that Holland is largely coasting along on his screen persona, his star power. He's not playing Nathan Drake. If you can get past that, you'll probably like Uncharted a little bit more, but I just felt all throughout the movie that I just couldn't get past his casting, because honestly, it just didn't feel like he was suited to the role. But maybe that pales in comparison to Mark Wahlberg as Sully, who basically is not even attempting the pretense of playing the character. He basically showed up on this movie and went, I'm gonna be Mark Wahlberg, and that's exactly what he does. If I claim that Holland is largely just coasting along on his established screen persona, then that goes double for Mark Wahlberg. Mark Wahlberg is just basically playing a variation of himself, and there's no attempt really to do anything more than that. I almost kind of admire it. It's telling that the film waits until the mid-credits scene to finally give Wahlberg the character's signature mustache, almost as if making him look like the character he's supposed to be playing was an inconvenience. So Wahlberg, even more than Holland, is grossly miscast here, but even though both of them are both wrong, they do make a weird kind of right together, because they actually have chemistry. Their kind of bickering banter does actually have genuine comic timing, and so the dynamic between the two characters, this kind of mentor-student, father-son kind of vibe, almost surrogate brother in some respects, because of course Sully was the last person that saw Nathan's estranged brother, so he's kind of living him through Sully in a certain sense. There is that kind of vibe there. That works and gives the movie a spark of life. Yes, it isn't the characters from the video game and they're doing something different, but you know what? That different, at times, it kind of works and you almost forget about it if it weren't for the fact that the movie doesn't seem to realise what a thing it actually has, because there's a lot of the movie where the two characters are separated. They spend a lot of the first act together, but then, once the movie relocates to Barcelona, there's a long stretch of the movie where the characters are separated on various different paths, and then, going into the third act, there's a big chunk of the movie where Wahlberg just drops out of it for just an extended period of time and then just shows back up again. And so that means that there's less of that kind of dynamic between the two than you would actually expect. And that means that the movie kind of loses a lot of what actually made it a little bit fun in the early stages. And maybe those absences were keenly felt because between the big set piece moments, Uncharted is uncharacteristically flat. An adventure movie should have a kind of propulsive energy about it, especially a treasure hunt one where the audience has the fun of trying to figure out the mystery alongside the characters, but Uncharted is dominated by scenes of characters in dimly lit locations spouting dry exposition to each other that you won't retain because none of it is interesting. And I know that this is an incredibly cliche criticism of video game movies, but honestly, it feels like you're watching an unskippable cutscene. You're just frantically trying to press X to skip, but you can't do that here because you're in a movie theatre. So in that respect, Uncharted is a bit of a success. It feels like you're watching someone else play Uncharted, but it doesn't work as a movie. And I know that this is not going to be Indiana Jones or up to that kind of standard, but it's not a national treasure. It honestly feels like the kind of very middling video game adaptation of something like Tomb Raider from a few years ago. It feels exactly like that, where they've got a few moments that they've replicated from the games, and the rest of the movie is padded around with this dry story and characters that you honestly don't care about. And especially bad in that respect are the villains. Now, the movie establishes that Nathan is a newcomer in an extremely cutthroat world, and I mean cutthroat literally, because there are several instances of that over the course of the movie. And so characters don't really have much of an allegiance or loyalty to each other. They will betray each other at the first opportunity. But oh my god, does the movie oversell that particular aspect, because when the film can't decide how else to make things exciting and raise the stakes, it just has the characters turn on each other. And that can be effective maybe once, twice if you're lucky, but Uncharted does it several times, to the point where it becomes almost farcical. I haven't seen a movie with this many changes of allegiance since the third Pirates of the Caribbean movie, and it has exactly the same problem that that film did, in that it becomes marred in its own plotting because of it, and also it completely just makes a mockery of the characters' motivations because you don't know why they do things anymore other than just to swerve the audience. Like, I know the characters are in it for themselves, but I need more than that, and it just becomes really unclear and arbitrary. The more betrayals that happened, the less interested I became. I eventually gave up after a certain point. And also, it reveals characters as not actually having all that much to do in the grand scheme of things. Like, Antonio Banderas is the film's main villain, and he's hardly in this movie for a lot of it. He's actually in the background for much of the second act, and then gets really badly squandered in its third act, and I feel like Antonio Banderas is such a charismatic performer. He's a perfect fit for this bad guy role, because 20 years ago he could have played the lead in this kind of movie, but it feels like Banderas has recently been coasting on in these for-hire villain roles that honestly could have been played by anyone in this movie's case. It really feels like he doesn't have a whole lot to do here, and that's incredibly disappointing. Banderas deserves better than how he's treated in this movie. And likewise, the other characters, some of which have been imported from the games, like Chloe Fraser. Chloe Fraser is very prominent in the film's second act, and then, again, in the third act, just gets sidelined. There's a whole bunch of characters here that just simply exist to set up plot turns rather than because the story actually requires them to be there. Perhaps the only interesting villain in the movie is Tati Gabrielle's Joe Braddock, who is by far the most ruthless of the fortune hunters, but that might just be because of the fact that she has the most screen time and also has some major action set pieces with both Wahlberg and Holland. In fact, in Wahlberg's case, her big showdown with Sully is in the most bizarre locale you can possibly think of, which is a Papa John's in Barcelona that just happens to have a glass wall that links to an ancient cave with a key in it. I've heard of some really contrived excuses for product placement, but I really want to know, how much did Papa John's pay to have a fight scene take place in one of their restaurants? That is one of the oddest product placements I've ever seen. At least Fleisher does actually deliver when it comes to the action for the most part. In perhaps a tacit acknowledgement of how unintentionally sleepy a lot of the film is, it actually opens with one of its biggest set pieces, the cargo plane stunt that it's replicating from Uncharted 3, which I find to be a really curious decision because it's completely without any context. You don't know any of the characters at this point, especially if you've never played the games. And yeah, it starts the movie on an adrenaline pumping high, but it comes quickly crashing back down to earth once you realise that this actually takes place 2/3 of the way through the story, and now we're going to have to catch that up. And it reveals the real story itself that opens with a scene of the Drakes in an orphanage that you've seen in a dozen movies before this, just doesn't grip the viewer from the outset. So they literally just took something from later and plonked it at the start, and it feels graceless, especially because I actually feel like it undermines this major set piece when it pops up later, where, yeah, they try to replay it from a different angle, but I feel like it would have been much more effective as a parallel event where you can see the cause and effect actually happen. It would have been a lot more fun that way, whereas it feels like we've already seen this by the time it comes back a second time. So that's unfortunate, especially because that is an extremely lengthy set piece that feels like it goes on for at least 5 to 10 minutes, and especially because it feels like it's the one bit of the movie where they're really being faithful to the games. Certainly, it does again feel like you're watching someone play a video game, especially with the physics of that sequence, where it does feel like the moment in the Hobbit films where Legolas jumps on the collapsing bridge, which is not the comparison you want to invite a lot of the time. But while sequences like that do look extremely CGI, especially in comparison to real versions of that sequence, like say in The Living Daylights, at least there's a kind of bonkers energy to them that reminds you this is the guy that directed Venom. But it feels like Fleischer definitely loses his way of the movie around the middle portion, where the characters go into this underground catacomb tour of Barcelona, which on paper is actually several set pieces back to back, and yet it feels kind of disjointed and goes on for an incredibly long time. And there are some really absurd moments, like they just stumble upon this underground catacomb club. How did they not hear the bass from that when they were walking down the cave? That is some really good soundproofing. It's just very, very silly, but not in a really enjoyable way half the time. It just feels a bit dreary, and then when the action pops up, it's so silly, it kind of feels fun just through sheer force of will. This is a movie that climaxes with 2 pirate ships being dangled in the air from helicopters and basically has a mid-air pirate ship battle. That's fun, but why is the movie not consistently at that level? That is the energy that Uncharted really should be having to at least set itself apart from the Indiana Jones comparisons, but instead half the movie wants you to take it seriously, and then the other half of it feels like it's coming up with the most insane mayhem you can possibly think of. I wish that the movie actually had a bit more fun with itself, which is a bit of a strange thing to say in a movie that has such almost absurdist imagery at times, but definitely when the movie spikes in those action moments, you can feel what kind of movie it could have been in the right hands, and also if it had maybe the right kind of lead to kind of offset the ridiculousness enough. And who knows, maybe the filmmakers will get that right the second time around, especially given that exactly in the same way he did with Venom, Fleischer ends the movie with several mid-credit teasers that set up for a sequel, and especially in the mid-credits scene, it definitely feels like you're actually watching a scene from the film's follow-up. And the problem with that particular mid-credits scene is that honestly, it makes the fatal mistake of being a better looking movie than the one we've just watched, which, yeah, good for setting up for a franchise, but also makes you realise just how kind of underwhelming Uncharted feels. Uncharted is far from being the worst video game adaptation, especially in a subgenre listed with absolute trash, but that doesn't necessarily make it good. If anything, this is a very middling effort, and on its own terms, Uncharted is very generic and feels paint by numbers a lot of the time, without the wit or energy of the best of the genre, like Indiana Jones and Romancing the Stone, that it clearly wants to take inspiration from, but can't quite capture that magic, and any personality it has largely comes from Mark Wahlberg and Tom Holland. They elevate the material, especially when they're on screen together, and if you're a fan of those performers, you'll probably enjoy them just doing their thing. But it doesn't really feel all that much like the games in terms of their character dynamics, and honestly, the only other thing that sets this movie apart is the fact that it has some wacky action set pieces that feel like they've come out of a completely different movie. The rest of it is surprisingly dry, and if they do carry this on to being a franchise, they could do with actually trying to make it a lot more fun to watch, instead of feeling like a game that would be a lot more fun to play. If you like this view, then you can put some gold in my pocket at my Ko-fi page, or you can unearth my buried treasure at my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.